For those of you who don't know me, I'm Graeme Hogg. I'm this year's president of the Steamer Club, and so I'm going to try and control proceedings tonight. I do hope you've enjoyed a good summer. Those of us in Scotland have had to put up with some pretty miserable weather, but I know it's been a bit better in other parts of the country. My summer's involved pretty heavy Waverley involvement. Been sailing in the Western Isles, the Bristol Channel and the Clyde, and doing a bit of rope catching and retailing on Tinnebrew Pier. So tonight's Zoom meeting offers you two speakers who have at least three things in common as far as I can work out. They're both involved in publishing, they both live in the Cotswolds, and they're both related to well-known Clyde steamer captains, past or present. So our first speaker tonight is Kay Hutchison. Kay hails from Greenock, and after graduating from Glasgow University and what's now the Royal Conservatoire, she worked in the classical music recording industry. From there, she moved into broadcasting, both radio and TV, and she founded Belle Media in 2009 and has been active since in production activities, publishing and consulting. She's produced radio series, books and podcasts. One of the early books was Hurricane Hutch's Top 10 Ships of the Clyde, which was written by her father, Captain Robin Hutchison. He was a skipper on the Clyde steamers for many years, and I had the great pleasure of sailing under his command in my assistant pursering days back in the 70s, especially on the Cowell in 1971. Further books include the Captain Bobo series for the younger steamer enthusiast, and a recent item on the club website describes Kay's work with the Waverley excursions to create related activity sheets for the kids on board the ship. As a youngster, Kay was steeped in steamer talk from her father, and she even worked on the steamers for a while. She has an abiding interest in heritage transport and has continuing connections with Scotland. Kay's talk tonight is entitled Books and Stories, so I'll hand over to you, Kay.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen here. Hopefully you'll be able to see the first slide. Well, thank you very much, Graeme. Although we do lots of other projects, I thought you might be interested in some of the work, both books and stories, that I've been involved with that's linked to the Clyde, and how I've used my media experience and love of the ships and steamers and my own family story to help keep the tradition of the Clyde alive for future generations. And you won't be surprised that there's also a link to my father, who was in the Clyde for over 35 years. And during those years, my father gave many talks about the ships and the people he worked with. I remember him preparing them. And he always saw the funny side of things that happened on board and became quite the storyteller. He also loved the West Coast. Here I am with him around his 80th birthday on our way to Portavadie with the Kyles of Bute looking beautiful in the background. And here he is on his 80th birthday. We had a great celebration. We even got Old's Bakery, where my mother worked, to create a special cake with icing sugar captain's hats, anchor and lighthouse. But we also realised at that time that without my mum, who died a few years before, and without his busy work life, which was really, his total fascination, and even his beloved dog that had recently had to be put down, he was really becoming a bit bored. And we'd always said to him, look, you should write a book with all your stories in them. And we thought, perhaps this is the time. And so after a little encouragement, he started putting together his list of top 10 ships. Now, we'd absolutely no idea how much work would be involved. Here's just one pile of many piles of source material we gathered together. One thing to highlight in the foreground of this picture, bottom right, that image was taken immediately after the Greenock Blitz, showing a flooded bomb crater just in front of the house where my dad was brought up. And the night before, a 2,000-pound parachute mine exploded a couple of 100 yards away from the house. Luckily, it half sunk into the boggy ground before it exploded, But even so, it shattered all the windows, brought down the ceilings, and covered the whole front of the house in mud. Dad was just 7 and sheltering under the stairs, but his mother, seeing the parachutes and thinking it was an invasion, she rushed to defend them. She went upstairs to the bathroom window with Grandpa's shotgun and started taking pot shots at what she thought was a paratrooper. She ended up being blown backwards into the bath with the force of the explosion. It really was quite a tale, and it's in the book. As I said, there was huge amounts of material to get through, and lots of people I should thank for helping get photographs, securing permissions, and making introductions. And it was also great to have Iain McCall write the foreword. We'd actually found a publisher, Ferry Publications, to publish the book, but eventually decided that their regular standard approach wasn't really going to work for something so personal. So we decided instead to publish through my own company, Belle Media. And so we got to work on what was now being called Hurricane Hutch's Top 10 Ships of the Clyde. The book went to the printer just before Christmas that year, ready for the book launch events at the Riverside Museum in Glasgow and the Maclean Museum in Dad's hometown of Greenock in early January. This is a composite of our time at the printers, watching the whole process of colour correction and print tests, and right through to the binding as well. And this is me checking one of the pages. In fact, I'm pointing at a photograph of my dad at age 7 with his parents, not long before the Greenock Blitz I mentioned earlier. And to give the book a bit more of a personal feel, we included the images of Dad's captain's hats, epaulettes, uniform buttons, and even his seaman's record book, just to help bring the whole design together. And although producing the book turned out to be a really great experience, especially for Dad, as it brought him back in touch with many of his friends and the people he'd worked with over the years, I do remember near the end of the process, when we were proofreading and doing the final fact checking, we had to call him up many, many times to check details. And he would also often answer the phone with a groan or a sigh. Oh, what now? Because it was really a lot to check. But we got there in the end. And I look happy, if a little tired in this picture. That's because I'm holding the very first copy of the book, fresh from the binders. I soon got into trouble, however, with my father for him getting some of the facts wrong in amongst all those phone calls. Anyway, I'm sure many of you spotted the odd mistake. It was our very first book, and we certainly made sure we made corrections when we went to reprint. So my dad started out deep sea, but switched to the Clyde and Caledonian Steam Packet Company when my brother Glenn and I came along. So it was quite a long career. And there were many great memories for me too, whilst working on the book, looking back on my time growing up on the Clyde. And it made me realise how much the people and the ships had become part of our lives through Dad's constant storytelling. And as I said, and Graeme said at the beginning, I worked in the ships myself as what was known as an ATRA, otherwise known as an assistant tea room attendant. And my abiding memory is buttering hundreds of scones every day and storing them in black plastic bin bags so they didn't go hard. I was very aware of all the stories of what went on the ships, the characters like First Mate Linda and Captain Peacock, or Peahen as he was known. So many nicknames, including the giant fish eater, I guess he liked fish. There was Vindy Lou, whose real name was Curry, that's Captain Curry. Reuter, who always seemed to know the latest company gossip. There was Bleep, and there was Boing Boing. And I think Boing Boing's real name was Springer. Anyway, I remember the laughs and the comments about the food on board, the stories about endless coffees on the Gurk Dunoon run to keep them awake during the long days of short crossings. Anyway, here's a Greenock Telegraph shot of one of those choppy crossings. I'm sure the coffee flowed that day. Also, I was aware of the many keen enthusiasts that Dad talked about, and because of the book, I came to know them too. And that's partly why I'm a member of the Clyde River Steamer Club, because I began to appreciate the work that's done, the knowledge and the extensive archives held within the group that are so important. My dad's favourite ship was the Maid of Argyll. Mainly, it must be said, because it was his first ship as master. Here's the famous trip of her going under in Shinnon Bridge, photographed by Colin Miller, on her way up the Cart to Paisley on a charter in September 1966. I appreciate that for most of you, the focus will be on the ship and the journey, but to me, it was always about the people. And just to prove the point, in this nice photograph, I know that one of the two little white dots on the wing of the bridge is my father, because that's where he'd be. He was in charge that day. And so far as I'm concerned, it's him. And when Dad was invited to sign books at the meeting in Jury's Inn, Eric Schofield, remembering Dad's favourite ship, kindly presented him with a copy of one of his beautiful Maid of Argyll shots. Eric also perfectly demonstrates the depth of knowledge that exists within Clyde River Steamer Club when he wrote to me about that photo. And I hope you don't mind me repeating this, Eric. The photo was taken on Sunday, 21st May 1972, about 3:30 p.m. Maid of Argyll was on the afternoon cruise from Gourock to Tinnabrooch, whilst Maid of Skelmerley was on a charter sailing for Queen's Park Camera Club from Glasgow to Loch Striven and Ridden. I was in the second snark, which, with the Waverley, was on a charter sailing to Loch Ridden, brackets, the second snark acting as a ferry between Waverley and Ormadale Pier. Incidentally, he continues, earlier in the day, I had photographed another of the maids, Maid of Cumbria, which was at Bartley Curl's Elderslie Yard undergoing conversion to a car ferry. The fourth sister ship, Maid of Ashton, was laid up in Greenock throughout 1972. So pretty impressive, detailed knowledge. And it's great that so many club members keep those details of the past. And talking about the past, let's take a quick detour back to those wonderful 50s and 60s. This Millport postcard, and I confess I did get it online, brings it all back for me. And it certainly evokes happy memories of sunny summer holidays when my mother rented a cottage for a week or maybe even two on Millport. But holidays weren't quite the same for us as a family. It was also obviously the height of the summer season for the ships. And so Dad rarely got leave, and he was working long hours and weekends too. So when we were little, my brother Glenn and I would usually only see him when he was on a rota where his ship came into Millport Pier. We'd wave to him up on the bridge when he arrived, and we'd wave him off again as the ship left a few minutes later, and that was about it. Those summer seasons were so busy back then. In one 21-day period, he worked on every single one of the 19 separate ships that plied the Clydes, car ferries, paddle steamers, turbine steamers. He said he nearly wore out the car, having to go from port to port to pick up the next ship. Latterly, he did get the odd day off in the summer, thankfully, and here he is again on Millport Pier with Mum and my brother Glenn in a family snap. We went on to create an audiobook of Hurricane Hutch and thought hard about who should narrate. Finally, we decided to approach Bill Patterson, especially as he's a great supporter of the Waverley and Maid of the Loch restoration. But it wasn't that simple. It turns out he decided to give up narrating audiobooks altogether a year or so before. And so we were honoured when he actually said yes. It seemed a book about the Clyde was something he just couldn't resist. This is him in the studio on the day of the Hurricane Hutch recording. So what next? Well, we felt that the Hurricane Hutch stories, the characters, the nicknames, ships, the locations, the Waverley, also lent themselves to a children's book series. And so we decided to turn some of the tales into what we were now calling The Adventures of Captain Bobo. Why that name? Well, Hurricane Hutch was one nickname Dad had, but he was also known as Bobo. And he got the nickname thanks to his friend, Captain Peacock, who brought his 3-year-old son up onto the bridge one day and told him, "Say hello to Robin." The wee boy couldn't quite get the name out. All he could manage was Bobo. and everyone burst out laughing and the name stuck. So that's why we chose Bobo for the books. However, Bobo was a very different type of project compared to my father's real life story, as we were about to find out. The children's book market is far more complex and rather overcrowded. Baptism of Fire comes to mind, and you're competing with great authors, classic books that parents and grandparents already know and love, and celebrity authors that the shops want to promote. And on top of that, we wanted a picture book series. So you need illustrations too, plus specialist editors to help get the text right for the target age group, whilst also working to a very tight word count. And yes, we do have knitted characters too. The first stage is obviously the story. And we chose stories, believe it or not, that came directly from Hurricane Hutch, or stories we had discovered in our research. Next comes the illustrations, developing each of the characters, working with our illustrator, Matt Rowe, to capture the fun of the stories. Captain Bobo had to have a dog, as my father loved his dog. It was a total priority, so much so that I remember often being squished into the backseat of the car with my mum, my brother, and our friends, whilst the dog sat happily up in the front passenger seat watching the view, together with my dad. Anyway, this is the first draft character development of the dog Salty, and the first draft of the human characters. And not if all of these made the cut, and we certainly couldn't have Puffy with a pipe. That was completely out. And these eventually became Sheila, the first mate, Puffy Watt, the chief engineer, and Bleep, the bosun. And then there's Emma, the apprentice engineer, Boing Boing, and Billy, the cabin boy, with his little pet mouse, Pinky. And then, of course, there's the ship at the centre of the action, or at least the Bobo version of the ship. And any similarity between this and any other well-known vessel is purely deliberate. Actually, we started out quite cautiously in terms of our relationship with the Waverley, but to be honest, the books have been sold on board more or less from the start, and our connection with the ship has continued to grow. They've already sold a good few hundred books on board, which I think is really fantastic. These are the covers of the 3 physical books. The first, Bananas, features an elephant being taken across to the islands, referencing the old days when they transported live animals on deck, and even a full circus. On the Rocks, top right, is set around an incident on what we call the Bannock Rocks. And London finds the ship and crew stuck when Tower Bridge fails to open. Now, when London was written, we were drawing on a historic incident. But of course, this actually happened last year. It happened to me. I was on my way to join the ship at Gravesend for the evening trip up to Tower Pier when a message came through that the cruise was cancelled because of problems with the bridge. So a real coincidence. Anyway, we enjoyed putting this 3rd book together and had lots of reference shots to help the illustrator capture the essence of the story. Again, not the detail you might expect to see. There's quite a bit of creative license taken with the images, but I think you get the idea. After publishing those books, the chance then came to pitch an audio series. And my background had been in BBC Radio, so that really helped. Great, we had 3 physical books, but unfortunately, they wanted 10 episodes of exactly 10 minutes each. So we had to get to work to start writing 7 more stories. And it turns out there's quite a bit of skill in writing to time like this, so it kept us rather busy for several weeks and months. And also, just to make things a bit more interesting, we thought this might also be the time to celebrate the strong Gaelic connection with the Glide. As I'm sure you know, many of the summer season crews were down from the Isles, and Gaelic was often heard on board. And my father built up many lasting friendships with those sailors and officers, and I remember them too. And additional stories would also allow us to follow the Waverley's routes and travel around the UK. including journeying beyond the Clyde to the Outer Hebrides in one episode, to North Wales and Llandudno in another, and take a trip to the Dorset coast in another. For the narration, Bill Patterson was obviously our first choice after doing Hurricane Hutch with us. But Bill actually suggested we approach someone else who he said who would be much, much better, his friend, John Sessions. Now here's John. He's in the recording studio, recording Captain Bobo here again. And sadly, it was one of the last projects he ever did. And he's a huge loss, really. John was a huge enthusiast, as you might know, with his holidays in the Clyde, with his auntie in Largs. But he was also a great voice talent with a huge range of character voices. And Bill was absolutely right. John said yes right away, and he loved working in the series. And he even did some interviews on Radio Scotland to support the series, which actually for well-known actors is really quite rare these days. So it was a real pleasure working with him. He was very generous. The series was run on the UK's only national station for children called Fun Kids, and they showcased Captain Bobo and said it was one of their best ever series. But we were also working with a consortium of community radio stations right across the West Coast that broadcast in both English and Gaelic, including Radio Skye and Nevis Radio. And so for those of you who might know a bit of Gaelic, Scéalachan a Chaitchin Bobo came into being. And Mark, I know you don't speak too much, but I hope you won't be too critical of my Gaelic accent because I'm just a learner myself. On the Gaelic side, we'd spoken with the Gaelic Books Council and they suggested some translators. And we were fortunate to be able to work with Gillibrigi Macmillan, who could both translate as well as narrate. He has a beautiful voice and is not only Gaelic University Celtic Studies lecturer, but an Outlander actor, a Gaelic advisor and musician, all rolled into one, just in case we want to branch off into something else. We went on to develop the stories as audiobooks and released them as a CD compilation in Gaelic with Gillibrigi narrating. We even had a slot on BBC Alapa's Evening News featuring Bobo, part of which was recorded on board Waverley, mainly to highlight the connection to the series. Now, having taken Captain Bobo onto radio, we then wondered if we could do the same in some way with Hurricane Hutch. After all, it was a book about people and places as much as it was about ships. So after a bit of a thought, we decided a good way of doing that was to pitch a 5-part documentary series about coastal cruising called Stormy Weather, featuring Waverley, Queen Mary, Balmoral, Medway Queen and Kingswear Castle. We took it to Times Radio and suggested transport historian Tim Dunn as presenter. Times Radio liked the pitch and identified an ideal slot on what was then the Michael Portillo Friday evening programme. Once again, we'd invaluable help, this time from Richard Turner and the audio archives of Paddle Steamer Preservation Society, and of course Paul Sempo, John McGoran and Michael McLaughlin, amongst many others. Times Radio were so happy with the series, they repeated it in their Best of Times Radio slot, and we also picked up a couple of awards for Stormy Weather, including winning the IPG Best Audio Award. A couple of highlights. This one's for Iain, there's your brother there. First episode on board Waverley. Initially, it was a very dull and drizzly day. And it was also the day the boilers wouldn't ignite because of some tiny little piece that made it all go. So it was quite a nail-biting delay, which actually in the end worked out well for us because by the time we passed Greenock, the clouds had parted and we had the most perfect day on the sail down to Largs to do all our interviews. The programme ended with us leaving the ship at Largs and going off to do what everyone does and my most favourite seafront cafe in the world, Nardini's. This is a shot of Waverley leaving just after we disembarked. And it was a lovely day in the end. And we loved that, doing that episode. It was great. At Gillingham, we saw what a great challenge they have in restoring the Medway Queen, but also their absolute determination to succeed. For that programme, Tim interviewed seaside historian Catherine Ferry, and we drew on Richard Halton's book and a very poignant excerpt from First Officer Lieutenant John Graves' account of the last crossing from Dunkirk. And the whole story really resonated with listeners, and Times Radio told us that. The most challenging moment was in planning the episode with Kingswear Castle. The whole point was that KC was back in service, having just completed the first phase of its centenary rebuild. But about a week before we were due to do the recording, John McGoran called up to say, really sorry, but they need to keep going with the refit. So instead of a sunny day out in the water, just like this in Dartmouth, on an iconic paddle steamer, here we were, stuck inside a big corrugated iron shed, halfway up a muddy creek, clambering over scaffolding. But actually, again, it turned out to be a great episode and a lot of fun. It was really quite unique and interesting to see the synergy between the steam railway and the steamship firsthand. These are a couple of shots of the group being recorded, with Kingswear Castle up on the deck in the boatyard. Left to right, Tim Dunn, Sereny Damon, the marketing manager, Paul Merrington, and of course, John McGoran. Paul in the centre here, he's the Director of Engineering at the Dart Steam Railway and Riverboat Company, and he looks after both trains and ships. And also that episode ended with a huge treat for Tim. As you'll know, he's well known for his love of steam railways. And so arrangements had been made for him to be on the footplate for the trip from Kingswear to Paignton to pick up the train back to London. The steam train, gleaming in the sunshine, had just come back into service after a major overhaul. And for those interested, it's loco number 4277 Hercules, built in Swindon in 1920 and originally used for hauling heavy coal trains in the Welsh valleys. In 1964, it was withdrawn from service and sent for scrap before being rescued some 22 years later. Last week, I was back in Dartmouth. I'm actually in this photograph near the bow of a KC, and actually Tim Dunn was there with me too, as he'd been invited down by the Dartmouth Steam Railway and Riverboat Company when Waverley sailed in to meet her for the first time ever on KC's home river. It was really quite a moving experience, and the size of the Waverley coming in that route was just incredible. And as you can see, both ships were packed with much cheering and whistles blowing, and with a huge hearty reception from the hundreds of people lining the quayside. The steam train even joined in, so we had a few extra whistles. It really was quite an event. We continue to see our links with the Waverley grow. Both Captain Bobo and Stormy Weather are available as audiobooks online, with £5 from every download going to the Waverley Appeal. And for this season, Paul approached us as he was looking for something new, something aimed at children that come on board. Some of these longer sailings. He's very, very keen to enthuse the next generation. He asked us if we could put together a set of free fun sheets to help them explore the ship and learn more about Waverley. In the past, we'd published an activity book and comic strip for one of our other titles called Tigeropolis. So we're happy to say yes. And in the end, we produced 2 different Captain Bobo leaflets with 10 different ideas, all related to the ship. We come up with games and puzzles, quizzes, word search, and treasure hunts. And we also thought a Waverley-themed mini board game might not go amiss. The reverse has a quiz too, and they're available free on board from the souvenir shop. And hopefully some of you would have seen them on your travels over the summer. Separately, we do some Captain Bobo children's readings and talks in schools, and have even started some in Gaelic. Given Bobo's links to the steamers and the Clyde, we thought it might be a nice idea to bring together Gaelic medium schools from either side of the river. So we brought the children of Sandbank Primary across in the Western Ferries to meet with the children of Windhill Primary in Greenock. Some 80 school children came together to listen to Scéalachan a Hutch Bobo. And I followed the reading with a presentation about the background to the stories, a bit about the Waverley, and how things have really changed in the Clyde over the years. Clyde River Steamer Club archivist Bill Tomlinson kindly provided historic timetables and maps for the children to compare the routes of the past with today's very much slimmed down version. And just before I sign off, it'd be odd not to mention that we do produce other books and stories. Our latest is the original Paddington picture book in Gaelic. Our first print run recently sold out, and we were at this year's Edinburgh Book Festival, and will be at the upcoming We Write Festival at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow too. And BBC Alaba want to run a TV programme featuring the Gaelic Paddington books, and there's a possibility that they will have them ready for this Christmas. And who knows, we might also get them to do the Captain Bobo books next. I really hope so. So honouring the ship's connection with the Gaelic crews has led to us becoming the publisher of 5 different children's books, something we had never envisaged. And finally, it's just great to think that Captain Bobo could inspire children to learn more about the ships, maybe even encourage them to work on the ships too, or at the very least, go sailing on the Waverley this year or next. So even if I don't live in the Clyde anymore, my links are as strong as ever, and I'm very happy with that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kay. That was great. It's terrific that you're trying to encourage the next generation of steamer lovers, because judging by the faces on the screen at the moment, there's not too many of them about right this minute, but hopefully that's going to change in the future. The other thing I really enjoyed was the shot of the Maid of Argyll going under the Inchinnan Bridge, because the very first thing I did when I joined the steamer club as a wee boy in 1966 was to go on that charter. So happy memories. Thanks again. Excuse me. We'll keep things moving. Tonight's second speaker is Iain McCall. Iain recently joined the club committee, where his publishing expertise is going to be extremely useful as we chart the way forward in this area of the club's activities. His involvement in other steam enthusiast bodies around the country is also going to be invaluable to us. Iain's father was the well-known maritime author and publisher Bernard McCall. Following his father's death, Iain integrated the publication of his coastal shipping magazine and books with his own railway publishing business, Mainline and Maritime, which offers a huge range of titles from its base in Chippenham. A recent publication of local interest is Scottish Steamers in the 1930s, which you may well have seen. Excuse me. Iain's father introduced him to ships at an early age, in fact, 8 weeks old. From there on, his interest has developed, and he now has an 11-year-old son, Paddy, who is ship mad. His other shipping connection is that his brother is one Dominic McCall, captain of a certain paddle steamer. Iain volunteers in a number of management and administrative roles for a variety of organisations, including the Iona Community, the World Ship Society, the Arrogage Railway Society, and several heritage railways. Iain's talk tonight is 30 Years of Scottish Ferries. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Iain.
Thank you, Graeme. See if I can make this button work. It worked the other day. There we go. Hopefully, what can you see?
I can see you at the moment. Here we go.
There we are. You can still see me, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. Just to add on to the introduction, my introduction to shipping was 8 weeks old on the side of the Manchester Ship Canal. People think that was a bit early for my father to start indoctrinating us. Dominic was actually taken home from the hospital at 2 days old via Cardiff docks, specifically to see a freighter that had berthed there. when I was asked to do this talk, it was suggested that I do something about my connection with the West Coast, because obviously I'm down here in sunny Chippenham, or rather wet Chippenham as it's been today. And the easiest way of doing that is to put this picture up, which shows a 4-year-old me. It's the Glen Sannox. It's 1978, and we're spending a family holiday cruising the Clyde on the Glen Sannox. I'm told I was on first name terms with all the crew, and they all looked out for me and made sure that if I run away too far or whatever, I was soon returned to mum and dad. So that was the start. We've then visited Scotland. My parents loved Scotland. We visited every 2 or 3 years or so on family holidays. I ended up going to university at Strathclyde, but I don't remember very much of that. I think there was too much alcohol involved. So there was a little bit of steamer interest. And then after graduating, I had a job that involved a lot of travelling around. Did do some work at Torness Power Station on the wrong side. Yeah, so this is just a collection of pictures. I'm not claiming to be an expert on the ships, because I'm conscious that I'm speaking to an audience which knows far more about the ships than I do. So we'll just look at some nice pictures of ships, and I'll give you a wee commentary along the way. We will, if I can make this work. Why is it not moving? There we go. Yep, so that's the Sannox at Brodick during one of those excursions. We'll see Brodick again a wee bit later. I'm told that I'm not allowed to do a presentation without including a shot of the Waverley. So that's the Waverley at Porton Cross, which I think was Easter '95. But as I say, it was an alcoholic days at that time. Just missed going on the Queen Mary. That was the only shot we got of her laid up in Greenock in 1978. So this talk originated as a talk to one of the local railway societies. And the idea was that we'd do a little journey from Stranraer to John O'Groats by sea, looking at some of the developments that have been along the way. So if we're going to talk about Scottish ferries in the West Coast, in the far southwest, I think one of the most dramatic developments was this beastie. It's debatable whether it ever actually made a profit for Steno because of the enormous fuel bills, but it certainly got the public's attention. Moving up the coast, again, you can tell the origins of the talk to a railway society, and this is as good a view of Weems Bay Station as it is of the stern of one of the streakers. I think that was the Saturn, but I might be wrong. No doubt somebody in the talk will correct me at the end. So 1978 and 1980, we went back in 1980 and we did a rover ticket of the ferries. And I had, you remember the old Yellow and Red Iain McCall books, Ships of the Fleet? And the 6-year-old me had one of these books and carefully marked off. It had an S if I'd seen the ferry, a T if I'd travelled on the ferry, or a P if I'd taken a photo of the ferry. And so this is a compilation, the old shots of those trips in 1978 and 1980. And the good thing in those days was that you had no danger of getting on the wrong ship because it was emblazoned across the side. And there's a later shot of the same one on, I suspect, a Clyde River Steamer Club excursion, judging by the numbers of people there. There's certainly not on ferry duty. And now we get that, or things of that ilk, and it's just not quite the same, is it? Let's be honest. Big competitor, Western Ferries. We never went on Western Ferries because you had to pay extra to go on Western Ferries, whereas the Calmacs were in your over ticket. But we've got the sound of Schooner, 30 years on, we get a different sound of Schooner. And again, it just shows the growth in car and vehicle traffic on that crossing. We did go on Western Ferries to Isla, and I can't honestly remember why that was, why we didn't use the Rover ticket for that crossing. Knowing my father, there'll have been a ship involved at one end of it or the other. So that's Sound of Gear. Back on the Clyde, we've got the Kenilworth. Connection to that is I spent about 7 or 8 years in Southampton, and obviously she's one of the old Hythe ferries. Garrick Head, I couldn't find a picture of Shield Hall on the Clyde, but I'm told that there used to be some days out on these ones as well, which no doubt people will remember. Pioneer at Boddick, that's a steamer club cruise in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I can't remember the year of that one. Again, I'm sure that some of you will have been on it and will have detailed records that you can educate me on later. That is the only picture of a ferry that I took at university where the ferry is actually horizontal in the frame, because most of the time I was too alcoholic and I was wobbling backwards and forwards and sideways and round and round. Hebrides at Ewig. That, I think, is my favourite shot from my father's archive of 1978, 1980. Again, I remember as a small child, this must have been 1980 up in the Western Isles. But I remember as a 6-year-old being absolutely fascinated by the lifts and the hoists, because down south we didn't get any of that. Our ferries, you just drove on and drove off again. And this idea of being lifted up was just surreal. Again, talking about 30 years of development, that's Hebrides at Ewig 1980. That's Hebrides at Ewig in 2005. So the development of the port, the development of the ferry and the size of the ferry. Also, we've got the fish farm tender here. And I think those two views just show how much the scene has changed in the intervening 25 years. Hebridean Princess, obviously all familiar with it. I was delighted to get her. I was working down in Sizewell in Suffolk at the time, and took myself on a day trip up to Lowestoft up the coast, and she'd just emerged from dry dock. So that's one of the more eccentric connections to the West Coast. Moving up to Stornoway, and again, developments in ferry size. Ullapool Stornoway, we begin with the Sullivan. Oops, sorry, I've got that wrong. They're in the wrong order. We'll come back to that talk in a minute. That's the Sullivan. There's the Isle of Arran, speeding out of Oban. I think she was on a Colonsay run at that point. The Isle of Ferries in 2005, Heb Isles and Isle of Arran. Lottie, again, coming into Oban, one of the classic viewpoints. And this is where Sullivan should have been. It should have preceded this shot, which is the Isle of Lewis being launched from a certain well-known shipyard in Port Glasgow. Again, it just shows the size and scope when you compare the size of Sullivan to the size of her. But she wasn't big enough because Calmac had to charter in a freighter, Muneg. Moving on to the smaller vessels in the Calmac fleet. I'm just looking at time check here because I'm conscious I'm talking a lot. Yeah, work out time. So a lot more on the small isles. In 1987, that picture is, she did a series of cruises as well as her small isles trips. And we went on her from Carl of Lacalche, and she went down to Mallaig. And so that's her pulling away. Development again, being replaced by the Loch Nevis. Corwis. I was fascinated going on that. This is a 2005 shot when she was on Mallaig Armadale. And it's the most ferries that you go on, the crews, when they're getting you to park your car, they get you all up the front. And CRSC, they built a little island round the centre of the ship. So the first car on parked in the centre, and then they went either side, and then they went one in front, one behind. And so there was almost this circular formation of cars in the ship, which I think says something about the crew's views on her stability on that crossing. But there we are. It was an experience. Then we move on to the small vehicle ferries. I never saw, or at least I have no recollection of seeing, the turntable ferries in Calmac service. So obviously where you go if you want to see one now is Kyle Ray. Superseded or converted to ramps, and there's the Largs off Largs at the time when she was spare vessel to Isle of Cumbrae. I suspect that was probably taken from the Glen Sannox on one of the cruises that I referred to earlier. Then we get the Island class. This is the Bruinish coming into Oban. And there's what they did to the Island class in the, yeah, I'll use the word bastardization of the egg. Bruinish alongside, and whoever thought that that wheelhouse was a good idea, it's not done much for the aesthetics of the ship, has it? Let's be honest. The concept of landing craft ferries was taken up by other government bodies. So you've got the Ellen Ahoy there. And again, 30 years of transition, because here we have the Localsh coming into Kyle. That will be a 1980 picture, I think. And they got sold to Ireland. And that's a 2005 picture of the ex-Kylakin at the Passage East ferry in County Cork. Both the ferries, the Kylakin and the Localsh, ended up on that crossing, as I'm sure you all know. Isle of Cumbrae, I've already mentioned. There she is in full flight. Again, I'm fairly certain that's 1980. She was not superseded, supplemented by the Loch class. And here we've got the Loch Striven at Sconser, unloading after a crossing from Marseille. And the ultimate development of the Loch class was the Loch Dunvegan and the Loch Fyne. Now, after Kyle, one of these two, and I forget which one, ended up on Fishnish to Loch Eileen. Loch Eileen has another place in the Bernard McCall How to Manage Your Family's Interest in Shipping, a list of anecdotes. Because my mother, as you may have already inferred, was a very tolerant lady, still is a very tolerant lady. For her 40th birthday, my father said, let's go to Scotland for the weekend. So she said, okay. And off they went to Scotland. What he didn't tell her was that they were going to Loch Eileen, because there was a coaster due at Loch Eileen Pier to load timber that same weekend. So that was as far as the romantic break went. What I haven't told you in telling this story is that my mother's birthday is at the beginning of February. And driving up from the south of England to Loch Eileen in the beginning of February for what was supposed to be a romantic getaway, my mother tells the story that she woke up at one point and the snow was coming sideways and she couldn't see the sides of the road, and she just shut her eyes again and prayed to get through. But my father got the picture of the coaster, so all was right with the world. Loch Buie on the Iona run. And for those who don't fancy going on the Loch Buie, that's the alternative Iona ferry. Highland Regional Council again. We're on the Corran crossing now. That's 2005 picture of the Rose Hall. Belle. I apologise for my abysmal pronunciation, by the way. Again, that's something you can correct me on later. Now, the many lives of the Iona. So this would have been a 1980 shot, I think, when she was working out of Oban. That is a Steamer Club charter. I believe that the date of that was the 8th of April 1990. Don't ask me why that date sticks in my head and the others don't. There must have been some significance to it that has long been forgotten. But there she is at Brodick on cruising duty. Then she became the Pentalina B, on possibly the world's most ramshackle jetty. And then a sad picture just to end this little sequence. That's her under arrest in Brest in Brittany. You can see she's in very poor condition. The foremaster's gone. When I travelled on her on that occasion, I thought she was looking rough. But after a time laid up and under arrest in Brest, that was the end of her. She was, I believe, scrapped locally. But again, I'm sure someone can correct me on that. North of Scotland, the traditional route was the old North Line route, Scrabster. That's the St. Ola. Very garish livery, which Northlink decided they could outdo by being equally garish. A couple of shots of the Orkney ferries now. Earl Thorfinn, one of the larger earls. Hoyhead, that's just coming into Line S. That's taken from the old Line S naval base on Scapa Flow. And then I promised you we'd get to John O'Groats. I said John O'Groats for 8 o'clock, and it's 6 minutes to 8. That's the John O'Groats ferry, Pentland Venture passenger ship across. So 3 ways to get to Orkney. And that, gents, is a whistle-stop tour from Stranraer to John O'Groats in 30 minutes over 30 years. That's me done. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ian. That was great. Certainly been right around the country and seen quite a few ships that probably not many of us have clapped eyes on for a while. So thank you for that. Sounds like you had a pretty interesting upbringing. Your dad taking you to all sorts of unusual places.